So
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming over. So I'm an American journalist and policy researcher. I represent an American think tank that's based in Washington. I'm the person here. And I've been here more than a year. I came first in June 2022. City was still almost empty. And I've been here ever since. I have an apartment here. I live here. I don't speak Ukrainian, so that's what I'm trying to learn. And I have a lot of respect for your institute. I've worked over this 18 months with two interpreters, both of them from your institute, and they were great. And I couldn't have even have done my work without them. They were really key. So I'm really pleased to meet all of you. And I'm secretly hoping that one of you, or maybe more than one of you, will want to work with me as an interpreter in the future. So I have a hidden agenda here. Why am I here? I'm looking for an interpreter. But I have again a lot of respect for your school. So I'm going to talk about how Americans view the war on Ukraine. And I call it, you can't see the slide, but I call I call the presentation the US front. Because the way I think of it, there's the Eastern Front and the Southern Front, but the Washington Front is maybe almost as important. And so and what I try to do in my job is to kind of be a go-between between what's happening here and to persuade people in Washington and Brussels. You know, I'm a journalist, I'm a researcher, I try to be honest, I believe I am honest and truthful, but I do have a hidden agenda, which is, you know, I believe in the Ukrainian cause, and I'm trying to tell Americans a story that will rally support. So it'd be nice if we could see those pictures and those words. So I start with, let's give it a second. Let's see if we can see the slide, because the slide is kind of part of it. Pictures are part of it. Okay, there we go. So next slide. There we got the US front. So next slide, please. Thank you. Okay. Can we make it a little bigger?
yeah, will do.
So kabuki, what is kabuki? So I'm starting with the present moment. Kabuki is political theater. And the important thing to understand about what's happening in Washington this week is that it's political theater. People operate in Washington. They don't, you know, reasonable people would sit down at a table and they would say, what do you want? And the other one would say, what do you want? And they would make a deal. That's not how it works in American politics. It's more like a Turkish market, right? Like one says, I couldn't possibly sell it to you for any less than $1 million. And the other says, no, I can only pay $1. Instead of like having an actual negotiation, they vote that way a few times. So they have a few votes where everybody on one side says $1 million, and then everybody on the other side says $1. And it goes back and forth like that, grandstanding and brinksmanship. And unfortunately, that's how it goes every time. I mean, I've been in Washington 25 years before I came here. That's every vote is like that. They grandstand, they fuss, they muss, they carry on, and finally in the end, they don't always pass something, but they often do. And so the way I'm cautiously hopeful that the aid package is going to come through. I'm not sure it's going to come through before New Year's fully, but they're going to have to make some progress before New Year's. The reason I think that is because I think a majority of senators on both sides want to help Ukraine. The president has more at stake in helping because his whole reputation and his, you know, is at stake here. But Republicans, there are also many who do understand. At the same time, what Republicans want is that really their voters are demanding more help on the border. So they really need that. So you have, you know, the Democrats want priority aid for Ukraine. Republicans want more money for the border. And an old-fashioned deal, you know, 30 years ago would have been easy in Congress. They would have sat down in a back room, no cameras, you know, smoking cigars, and they would have said, I need this, and the other ones would have said, I need that, and they would have made a deal. Now it's a perfect deal because both sides get something very important that they want, but they're having trouble getting there now. Now, will they get there? Again, I'm modestly hopeful. Mitch McConnell really wants it. Again, I've been in Washington 25 years. I've never bet against Mitch McConnell. When he wants something, he usually gets it. You know, even if you don't agree with his politics, very skilled parliamentarian. And part of the point is he's negotiating in a way that will make it easier for the Republicans in Congress to come along. They are less friendly than the Republicans in the Senate, but if McConnell cuts a good enough deal, I think enough of them will come along. So we'll talk more about that in a minute, but let's go to the next slide. Let's see if I can find my slides. Let's go to the next slide. I'm going to start to look behind the politics now and look a little bit at American public opinion. Because, the truth is American public opinion support for Ukraine is ebbing. People are tired. People have lost their sense of urgency. What we don't know is how much it's ebbing. So this slide tries to get at some of the numbers. So 4 recent polls, this is the top blue line on the right, 4 recent polls showed a range between 41 and 63% supportive. Now that's a big range, right? That's from a minority to 2/3 majority. And with polls, you never know. A lot depends on how you ask it. My rough guess is it's a little stronger than half, if I really had to say. But it's true, all the polls show that it's down 15 to 25% since the full-scale invasion. That's a lot. I mean, even if you're still at 2/3, it was better when it was 80. 20 points is a big drop. Even more scary than that, when you look a little deeper, only 40% of Americans think that stopping Putin will give other tyrants something to think about. I mean, that seems to me crazy. When I was in Washington a month or so ago, I said, like, what part of the sentence that starts with Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, don't you understand? But apparently only 40% of Americans understand that, which is frightening. And the most frightening numbers here to me are the numbers on the left. If you look at that picture, look at the black. So the print's tiny, I'm sorry, but the black bars are all voters. So the blue and red are Democrats, the yellow is independent, but just look at the black. That's the bars at the top are the number the share that says support Ukraine as long as it takes. And the bars on the bottom are the ones who say, let's urge a negotiation as soon as possible. And the point is the American public are split on that. So even if they say they're supportive, many of them don't understand the conflict enough to know that negotiations aren't practical, aren't possible, aren't whatever. So, ignorant public getting fatigued. We'll come back to this in a minute. I don't say this to depress you. I mean, the reason I look at these numbers and the reason I look at everything we're going to talk about today is to think about how to persuade these people, right? Like, let's understand the people that you're trying to persuade before you go and talk to them so you can make a better case. So I'm not showing you these numbers to depress you. We're just looking at them to try to figure out how to make the case. So now let's go a little deeper. Let's look at the next slide. Because the point is that I'm going to think a little bit about history, right? American history. Because if you think of American history, there was I think it was Kennan, but I can't find the reference. But somebody, when I first started to think about American foreign policy, said American foreign policy is like a dragon. It's a sleeping dragon. Much of the time it's asleep and it doesn't do anything. And then periodically it gets woken up and it thrashes around and rages around and does something in the world. And I think that's a very smart way to think about it. For much of our history, we've been saying, no, we're sleeping here, don't bother us. It's warm and cozy here. We're not going to get involved in the world. And then every now and again, we wake up and we get involved in a big way. World War I, World War II. I mean, you can say whatever you want to say about the Soviets, but, I would say neither war would have had the outcome it had without the US. And we got very involved and sent a lot of people, sent a lot of material, people died. But in between, there's a long kind of hum of we're sleeping now. And, if you like Tom Paine, I mean, he's not even considered an isolationist. He's considered, a sort of mainstream American actor. Back in the time of the American Revolution, he said, oh, we don't need any French help. We can do it by ourselves. And George Washington gave talks that sounded a little bit isolationist. We're doing fine here. We don't need to get involved in the world. Thomas Jefferson called foreign, getting involved in the world, entangling alliances. It was not meant to be an encouraging term. And it goes on and on. There were people who opposed World War II. There were people who opposed important, powerful people. Robert Taft was almost president. He opposed NATO and sending troops to Europe. And of course, there was the reaction of Vietnam. I grew up in the Vietnam era where people just said, stay away from the world. We don't know how to do it. We don't do it well. We don't have the moral authority to do it. So long history of this isolationism, and it's very dangerous in my view. And the question is, how do you keep America awake so we don't slide back to that? Because in some ways it's a default position, right? So let's go to the next slide. And I'm going to, but again, the important thing to remember, right, is that it does go in cycles. The dragon sleeps, the dragon wakes up, the dragon sleeps, the dragon wakes up. And what's really interesting is in some eras, it's the Republicans who are saying get involved in the world. And in other eras, it's the Democrats who are saying get involved in the world. And the positions have shifted many times, sort of like a soccer game where the advantage goes to one side. So this is just really interesting. These are the Republicans. Between the top bar is 1971, I believe, and the bottom bar is 2022. So that's, roughly 50 years. It's gone from being almost 3/4 support an active role abroad to not that much more than half support an active role abroad. So the two parties, again, they can change positions. It depends on leadership. It depends on a lot of other things. But again, and none of this is dispositive for how Ukraine should make the case or how Ukraine's friends should make the case. It's just, again, I think important to kind of understand. So we're going to keep going, sort of diving into next slide, into sort of trying to understand this isolationism a little bit better. So it comes in many flavors, right? It's not just one set of arguments. There's a Democrat version, traditional Democrat version. There's a traditional Republican version. Some isolation, and we're going to talk a little bit more about what they are in a minute. Some isolationists are against anything, no alliances even, get out of NATO, get out of, whatever, the UN, stay out of the UN, stay out of the League of Nations. Others say alliances, okay, but no war. Others say, well, maybe trade. Others say not even trade. So again, many different flavors. There's a kind of emotional version, we just don't like foreigners. Or we don't care about the world. And there's an intellectual version, which says we need to balance interests, the realpolitik. So, there's sort of a difference between just raw xenophobia and realpolitik, Kissinger calculation, right? Kissinger wasn't a xenophobe. Kissinger just thought we need to balance our interests. There's the version that says, don't do anything in the world. And there's the version that says, never mind Europe. We're going to leave Europe alone, but we care about Asia. So there are many, many, many different versions. Often the populist version is anti-immigrant, anti-Semitic. Often the populist version is anti-elite, anti-expert. So, the question is like, what version are we seeing now, right? And it's mixed probably, right? Because it's a big country and there's many opponents. So the question is, how do we address these various different flavors and different factions? So let's just look a little deeper. Oh, next slide. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to try to go deeper. And again, in a way, sort of try to psychoanalyze, right? Like what's going on here. Because in a way, there's 3 different levels, right? There's what people say, right? In life in general, right? There's what people say. There's what people are really thinking underneath what they say. And then there's also kind of the deep cultural assumptions and instincts that people have, right? That come sort of with the country, almost the culture. So these are the deep cultural instincts. And I know these because I grew up with many of them, right? Like many of us have them. One is that we're not, and you can see this not just in, me, but you look back at George Washington's quote, or Thomas Jefferson's comments or whatever, but we're not, Americans aren't totally convinced in the way I think Europeans do understand that the world is a dangerous place. I think we think like we're rational people and most people are rational people. And if we sat down and talked to them, we could probably get a deal. And, I remember being like this as a young woman, actually. My former husband, I was sort of this, we don't need missiles in Europe, we can have treaties. And my former husband said to me, aren't you afraid of anything? Don't you realize that the world is a dangerous place and that there are people who want to hurt us and want to hurt you? And there are many Americans, I think, don't quite understand that. Despite Hitler, despite Stalin, despite all the history. I think we also, and you see this in George Washington's comment, sort of second point, we think we're above we've often thought we're above Europe's petty quarrels, that Europe is really driven by nationalism and, history, and that we're above that because we're rational and we're a country built on ideals. And again, false illusions, self-flattery, whatever, but it often drives our thinking, let's just stay away. Those are petty quarrels. We don't need to get involved. Even if we think it's a dangerous place, we think we're protected by two oceans, right? And what finally got us into both world wars was somebody came across those oceans, right? Like German subs came across those oceans in before World War One. Oops, before World War One. And then before World War II, Pearl Harbor happened, right? So we think we're protected by the oceans until somebody comes across the oceans. We think we have enough problems at home. Somebody wants to find you urgently. We think we have enough problems at home. And again, we think we're hesitant about being the world's policeman. And that has two strands. One strand is we don't have the moral authority. Like, who are we to tell other people what to do? Look how miserable life is at home. And the second strand is, even if we do have the moral authority, we're not very good at it. So let's not try. Okay, let's go to the next slide if we can see it. So now I'm going to look a little bit at the difference between Republicans and Democrats. See if we can see the pictures. Lots of interesting things here. We're going to know all about you.
I don't understand why. I'm what bottom.
Okay, well, the Democrat rationales, and they're not so important right now because Democrats are being mostly helpful, but the Democrat rationales start with sort of a general predisposition against war, right? Like Democrats, as a rule, certainly my generation of Democrats since the 1960s think, it's better if we can do things peacefully. It's better if we can work it out. Guns are bad, missiles are bad, armaments are bad, weapons are bad. Do we really have to kill people? I mean, and it sounds like a joke, right? But I mean, there's a deep strain of thinking. Better treaties than troops. And again, I remember this very vividly, Europe in the 1980s and 90s. It's fun. Why do we need missiles in Germany and Poland? We can just have treaties with the Russians, Soviets. I mean, again, very childish notion, but it was a pervasive notion, at least half the voters. There's a sense that, again, that the US is basically an imperialist. Many Democrats feel US is a bad power in its own right. This was sort of the Vietnam era thinking. We're imperialists. We're driven by greed. Who are we to tell other people how to live, right? And then there's more kind of, for want of a better word, further left versions. Well, then there's fund the welfare state before defense. Very strong democratic impulse, right? Like what the government is about, what America should be about is helping the poor, and you can't have money for both, guns and butters. You have to decide, butter's more important. And then there's kind of leftist versions, Popular Front Solidarity, right? Sort of socialism, communism, like world peace. Why do we want to fight the Soviets? And then the most rational democratic version is about spheres of influence. So FDR, right, great hero in America, he said the Soviets can have Eastern Europe. Like, we'll take care of our hemisphere. They can't come to our hemisphere, but they can do whatever they want in Eastern Europe. And that was really Roosevelt's position. That's part of what drove Yalta. And, it only came to a crunch when Khrushchev tried to put missiles in Cuba, right? Because suddenly they were in our hemisphere. But I mean, it was a completely respectable notion. Let them have their sphere of influence for a lot of American history, Democratic side. So now let's look at the Republicans. And again, not all of this is present now, but a lot of it is present now. And it's kind of important to try to understand the different strains. So Republicans, let's start with what they're saying now. So next slide, if we can get there. So these are the things they say in public, right? And we're thinking here about the difference between what they say and what they really believe. And the good thing about the arguments is that the arguments are things that you can argue against, right? These are sort of rational things, debatable issues. You can offer them evidence. You can say you're wrong. Sometimes they listen. Sometimes some will not listen, but some will listen. So again, they think Russia is not a direct threat to the US. And they think that American foreign policy should be based on realpolitik. Like, don't try to destroy Russia because that will only come out badly, but let them have some let's put them in balance with other interests. You know, Kissinger played China off against Russia. So that was the sort of realpolitik view. The next argument is that the war is stalemated. We have no plan. You've all heard that. You know, again, it's something you can argue against, but it's something you have to argue. We have to argue against. We're spending billions in Ukraine instead of on the border. You've all heard that in the news. Again, can be argued against, but it's something that has to be argued against. And then there's corruption. We're throwing good money after bad into a bottomless pit. And again, it just has to be answered. And I spend a lot of my time trying to answer that one, but we can talk more about that. But now let's look at the next slide, which is what they're really thinking underneath these things they say. And this is a parallel to the blue slide we saw a minute ago. So there's a, and I think it's hard to know which of these, in some ways, this is the most important slide of thinking about the Republicans, because these are really the deep-seated impulses that we need to kind of try to counteract. And there's a big question about, to me, about which one are really most important. Because I think fiscal conservatism, for some, that's a very meaningful thing, right? So if you take, you know, how many Republicans are there in the whole Congress? Something like 250, 270, 250 probably. You know, in that 250, there's some who really are driven by, we can't afford to be too involved abroad, right? We got $1 trillion, whatever it is, $31 trillion debt. We can't spend any more. Then there are serious thinkers who think China first. We can't do both, and China's more of a threat, so we have to address China. Again, at least these rational ones can be argued with, right? But we're coming down here as we get to the third one is also a rational one. We shouldn't be carrying so much of Europe's burden. And again, you can offer an argument against that. Europe's doing a lot, you know, we're carrying it together. But then these last three are the kind of really irrational ones. And I actually think that, you know, it's in the partisan atmosphere of American politics today, Republicans standing against whatever Democrats are for, that's amongst their most important motivations. Like if Biden's for it, I'm against it. You know, the two parties are at such a crunch where both sides say and think that the other side is not just maybe wrong about a few things, but evil. And they both, the way that the voters work now, the way the districts work, you get elected by appealing to the most partisan voters. There's nobody who gets elected by appealing to the center. And so you tell your voters they're evil. And if they're for it, it must be evil. And we're against it. And I think that's a very, very strong element of what's driving a lot of Republicans now. I also think the next one is very important, populist resentment of elites and of Washington, right? And, you know, that's what really drives Trump. That's the main thing that drives Trump's popularity. That people who didn't benefit as much from globalization, people who didn't benefit as much from the prosperity of the last decades, think that they've been left out, like deliberately. And they think that the elites and the culture has left them out and is always dissing them, is always saying, you don't matter and you're stupid. You know, Hillary Clinton said deplorables, and the deplorables are angry. The people who were called deplorables. I don't think they are deplorable, but the working class people and people less non-college educated people are very angry in America. And Trump is their tribune carrier. And that's a lot of what's driving. They think, well, that war, we don't really have an interest in that war. We don't know the interest, we don't understand. But if those elites are for it, we shouldn't be for it. They're leading us down a path. So again, these are kind of deep-seated, like, you know, not things that people necessarily talk about, but I think these are the things that really drive. And then pro-authoritarian, you know, I don't know how much like actually sympathy for Russia is important to most Americans. I think for somebody like Trump, it matters. I don't know that it matters for a very big faction of ordinary Americans, but I think it's an element of what we're talking about here. So, you know, but the other sort of interesting thing is, and this should really have a picture, it doesn't, is the red line at the bottom. You do meet a lot of Republicans in Congress who understand the need to go on helping Ukraine, but they say, well, my voters are against it and I can't go against them. I mean, it doesn't matter if you can't vote the right way, like who cares? Well, why you can't vote the right way, in my view. But there, you do hear that quite a lot, especially the Republicans in the House, members who know better, who are sort of looking for a way to vote that way, have an excuse, something that it could go with, something that could get them off the hook, but they have to keep their voters happy. And that's why this border package is so important, right? Because if the guy who knows it's the right thing to do, but doesn't feel he can vote that way, he can say to his voters, well, look, we're getting what we need on the border. I have to hold my nose and vote for the Ukrainian aid because we're getting what we need on the border. And that's what he says, right? Because he has to play this kind of double dance of what you say and what your voters expect. So coming to the end, next slide. So it's important to, a lot of why I've been saying what I've been saying, it's really important to distinguish among Republicans, right? So Trump and Mike Johnson are really, really different. And it would be a big mistake to like think they were the same and think that you handle each other the same way. You don't handle a tiger the way you handle a pussycat. I mean, I'm not saying either is a pussycat, but you have to kind of know what you're handling. Trump doesn't really believe anything, right? Like Trump has no ideology, but Trump is pretty dead set. I think he actually has a grudge against Zelensky going back to the impeachment issues. And that's what Trump acts on. It's like personal grudges. So, who knows exactly what Trump believes or why. There's probably a strain of liking Putin, liking other dictators. There's probably a grudge against Zelensky. Who knows? He knows that his voters like it. It's red meat to his voters. So, I think those are the kinds of things that drive Trump. I don't think Trump is thinking realpolitik. Johnson, I don't think is actually a bad guy. He's brand new. We don't totally know him. He says he wants to make a deal, and I actually believe him. But he also needs to keep his job, right? So he has all these red meat people angry saying, don't vote that way. We need a border deal to go with it. So he has to somehow keep them happy and bring them along. But that's something very different to play with than Trump, right? Like that's someone you make a deal with and you figure out what buttons he needs pushed and you try to push them and then you hope push your buttons. So the last couple of slides, I'm going to just come back a little bit to the public opinion. So the polling, there's lots of different polls and they showed similar trends, but slightly different numbers. And again, I'm sorry, the PowerPoint is really hard to read. That's right. Yeah. So come back. Keep going. Next one.
Awesome.
She was right. You're right. Whatever it was. There you go. No, you skipped too far. There we go. Okay, so you can't see them, but what they are, this is for and against aid of various kinds. And this is a recent poll, November 2023. And what's interesting is the top three, the top one is aid to Taiwan, military aid. The next one is military aid to Ukraine. And then comes military aid to Israel. And look, like they're basically the same. So it's not unique to Ukraine. They're not saying we don't like you. It's part of a more general, how not sure we want to get involved in the world. Then notice the difference between the next one is humanitarian aid to Gaza. And it's not a lot bigger, but it's a little bit bigger, almost 5 points bigger. And again, that's kind of Democrats kicking in, right? We're not sure we like sending guns, but we do like sending water and, food or whatever. That's sort of the Democratic influence. So you're seeing some of these strands I've been talking about kind of coming in here. It's not about Ukraine. All those arguments about corruption, stuff like that, it's not that meaningful. It's about how involved we want to be in the world. And then when it's humanitarian, there's some people who like it, other people don't like it. Republicans say we should give them military aid, but not humanitarian. That's not our business. So it's very complicated. But then look at the last one, that's aid for the border, right? And these are all voters. So, there the numbers are 3/4 to 1/4 in favor of spending more. So, difference between half and half and 3/4, 1/4. It's why the border is important. It's why the border needs to be part of the deal. The border is not just a red herring. It's not just something Republicans are complaining about. The border really does have to be part of the deal. Next slide. So this is, should we continue aid to Ukraine or not? And again, I'm sorry, I can't see the words, but the bunch of columns on the left is increasing aid. The bunch of columns in the middle is decreasing aid. And the bunch of columns on the right is keeping it the same. And light blue is all voters together. Red is Republicans, blue is Democrats. And the good news here is that if you add up the blue that want to keep it the same and the blue that want to increase it, it's more than the ones that want to decrease it. So it's not a lot more, but still more. So, again, not all the polls are the same, but here you add up, what are the numbers? 30% and 18%, you get to 48, was more than 36. So, we got more than a 12-point lead, for at least keeping it the same, which is good. What's not so encouraging, well, the other thing that you could sort of take away here is that Republicans are split. It's not like all Republicans are against, right? Like 60% or whatever it is are totally against, but there's some that even want to increase it. And there's a good, robust number, a third, that wants to keep it the same. And so, again, pretty good news, or somewhat good news. 60% is scary. That's, I don't like that big red bar in the middle of the chart. It's also important to notice that there's not much support for increasing. It's important to notice the party differences, right? It's also important to notice that there's not that much support for increasing aid. Now, that doesn't mean spending more, I think that means keep it level, right? 60 billion would be in line with keeping it the same. It doesn't talk about what kind of aid we're sending, right? So I don't think there's any judgment here about long-range ATACMS versus short-range ATACMS, right? Like the public's not going to that level of understanding, but this is about the money level. And the good news is that, there's pretty still continued support for keeping it the same or even more. The next slide is a little bit scary. The next slide, so if you remember the slide we're just going away from, 36% are for some kind of decrease, right? And this is the numbers, this is a subset, right? These are just the people who want some kind of decrease. And the slides on the bars on the left side are who want to decrease it a little. The bars in the middle who want to decrease it a lot. And the bars on the right are those who want to stop it entirely. And those are scary numbers. Those are percentages of percent, right? That's about half of 36%, right? But half, so like 15% want to stop aid completely. The bars look maybe scarier than they are, but it's something to take into account. Like the people who are voting no aren't just saying, well, let's taper it off. A lot of them are saying, pull the plug. So sorry to end on a slightly depressing note. Now let's just have one more slide where we think about takeaways. And so, to me, next slide, we can go there. The big issue for me, my takeaway is that the real problem here is not about Ukraine per se. It's about American isolationism writ large. It's about a long historic trend of saying, let's stay away from the world, that has many different reasons and strands and complexities that all have to be dealt with. And the place to start in arguing with them is to try to help them understand that the rest of the world matters. The most important thing they need to hear about Ukrainian corruption isn't as bad as you think. And they need to hear we can win the war and all that stuff. But mostly they need to understand the rest of the world matters to you. Those oceans will not protect you. Some voters, and I've been doing this kind of work for a long time. It's true on this issue, but it's true on every issue. It's true on this issue as well. There's some voters, there's 15% of voters on the end sides of every issue. 15% who are totally with you, 15% who are totally against you. And the 60% in the middle are usually persuadable. So it's like you have to think about what are the best arguments to persuade them and think about how to pursue them. And it's no different. This is no different. Obviously, people in my position, people trying to persuade Americans, have to address voters on the left and right because the arguments are different, the concerns are different. We got to fight on both sides. We can't just say Republicans are the enemy, fight them. We have to say, like, both sides need some work. I believe that and I haven't shown you polling to suggest this, but I believe the most persuasive case is about basically US interests. Like the idea that we're sympathetic and we don't want to see people die and stuff like that, that's important, but it fades, right? That's what we had at the beginning of the full-scale invasion. Like, we don't like to see these missiles coming. Well, the missiles are still coming and fatigue is setting in. So it has to come to American interests. Like, why does this matter to them? We have to make that case. But I think there's also a case to be made there. The case I try to make, I'm not a military correspondent. The case I try to make to Americans is that having Ukraine emerge as the prosperous, democratic, market-driven country that it wants to be, that's in our interest. So it's not just getting rid of the Russian troops that are in our interest. Having a strong, prosperous democracy on the border between Russia and Europe really matters. And that's a US interest argument, but it's a little more complicated than just a military argument. But again, sort of the last thing I want to say and really, you know, what's the upshot here for all of you, is I do think there's a decent chance that we're going to get this package. Not slam dunk, not for sure, but I think still a decent chance. Is there going to be another package? I'm not so sure. You know, the 60 billion, let's hope it lasts a good year. After that, I just don't know. Because Trump, you know, very unlikely, but even Biden, the support is just ebbing too much. You know, something would really have to change for there to be another 60 billion in a year. I mean, we don't know, a year's a long way off, but that's why it's important that this one is big. But, you know, with that said, those of us who believe that it's essential for the US to engage in the world have to keep fighting. So, you know, I'm not going home after I make the slide deck. This is to just sort of give me a sense of where the enemy is. And, you know, Zelensky, I think Zelensky made the same calculation. That's why he's there. You know, it didn't look so good, but he said, I've got to go anyway. You know, again, the point for me, the reason I think it's important to think about this, the reason I sort of bothered to think it through for this deck, is that I think it's really important to know your enemy. And it's important to kind of know where to push the buttons and which buttons you have to push. And then we have to use that knowledge to make the best case we can. So I'm really interested in your reactions and what you make of America. And thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you for the lecture. It's very interesting sort of organization moments. You can see lecture very popular where you not have a chair for yeah. So maybe some questions for students. Друзі, задавайте якісь питання, тільки по можливості, щоб питання було одне питання, а не в одному питанні 25, щоб кожен міг сказати.
What do you tell them? Ask questions. What?
So, давайте групу і
Okay. Questions. And tell me where you're from when you speak. Who are you? Where are you from?
Are you asking about region or university?
Region.
Region. I'm from Rivne region, and my friend too.
Okay.
We all are.
We all, actually.
Okay. That's it. Yeah. Okay. 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 Okay.
I'm from Tema region.
Okay. Okay. So what do you all think about it? You know, when you think about America and what's going to happen, what do you think about it?
We haven't studied that subject for so long, but we need it. We need that help. We need that aid. If this war will last too long, we couldn't protect ourselves all by ourselves.
Yes.
I'm really surprised why among American voters, Trump is so popular, because he's like a crazy man. I don't understand this.
Yeah, well, so that's what I was trying to talk about, the resentment, right? So it's actually very similar in Poland, right? And maybe that's a little easier to understand. Like, you know, people in Eastern Poland, they felt like Poland joined the West, Poland modernized, Poland did all these good things, Poland was in Europe, but we got left out. It's still the same here in Eastern Poland as it was 30 years ago, that we didn't have development, we're not part of the West, they don't listen to us when we say we're not happy. You know, they're arrogant, the politicians that are, and the people who are benefiting. You know, you watch TV and you see ads for Teslas and $10,000 watches, and you can't afford a new pot. And you say, that makes me angry, I feel left out of my country. And that's what Trump voters are like. They're not as bad off as people in Eastern Poland, but they feel that the elites in California and in Washington, New York, are millionaires and they're benefiting from the world and they have bad values, they're corrupt, they're, you know, whatever. And we're home Americans, you know, playing by the rules the way we've always played, and they don't understand us, and we are angry. That's the basic impulse. It takes, you know, it comes out a little more subtly than that. And Trump was genius, even though he's a rich man from New York, he was a genius at smelling this anger and figuring out how to talk to them in a way that they could hear. And yes, and they know he's awful, right? Many of them, they watch him. I mean, from the beginning, many of them are very driven by you know, kind of like Christian old-fashioned values, right? And even when he said, I'm going to go grab women, you know, by their private parts, they said, well, it's not very nice, but everything else he says is right.
And do you think it will be increased
I think, who knows? I think he could be found guilty. Some of the cases are pretty far-fetched, right? Like some of them are pretty, like, you know, you had to push pretty hard to make that case, kind of. I think he could be found guilty. I don't think his voters care. I think his voters see the prosecution as, again, that elite. They just don't like us, and they'll use any dirty means they have to come after us. I mean, it's very unfortunate, right? It's very hard to even say, let alone, I'm certainly not defending it, but it's real. It's not, and then, I mean, then again, I mean, this is a little bit of a wrinkle, but I mean, I know many Republicans. I'm a Republican. I'm a McCain Republican, right? Wouldn't vote. I'm against Trump and never Trumper, but I was a McCain Republican. Many of my Republican friends in Washington say, we know how awful Trump is, but if it comes down to he's the Republican and Biden's the Democrat, we're going to vote for the Republican. Why? Because we don't like Biden's too friendly with the unions, or Biden wants a protectionist foreign policy, trade policy, or Biden, there's some other things that they don't like, where they say Democrats bad, Republicans good, even if he's horrible, we'll hold our nose and we'll vote. Yes.
Thank you for your presentation and for coming here today. My name is Alex, and my question is also related to Trump. So we all see like there a new candidate, which is much more pro-Ukrainian, and Nikki Haley, who used to be a permanent representative for the US to the United Nations. And recently she's beginning to gain much more popularity between the voters, and even the great funds are giving like the money for the promotion. So you've been working with the Republicans and with all of this stuff for many years. So what do you think? Is there any chance for her to win the?
Yeah, really good question. I mean, I think I pray every night, right? But the odds, it will take a miracle. I mean, miracles may be too strong, but Trump is it's like a train, you know? How do you derail the train? Trump is polling at nearly 60%. She's polling at 15. And even if you add DeSantis's numbers, so if DeSantis disappears, many DeSantis voters will vote for Trump because he was sort of a pale version of Trump. Even if all of them went with Haley, it would be 60-30. It would be 2-1. So it's going to, I mean, I think it's possible. And I have the deepest hope. I have she's a great candidate. I agree with her. She's wonderful on Ukraine. She's, you know, really presenting a good case. But I think it's a long shot, I'm afraid. I mean, I'm a pessimist on the election. I'll be candid. I'm an optimist on Ukraine, but I'm a pessimist on the election. I think it's Trump's to lose because I think it's going to take real, you know, it could happen. There's game theory, you know, there's theories. If she does well here, and then she does well here, and then she has a big win here, and then it'll all change. And that happens in politics. That does happen. But then I think he's still the presumptive, you know, most likely winner of the Republican primary, and Biden looks weaker every day. And, you know, let's hope that looks older, looks weaker, looks less popular. So I'm worried.
We are as well.
Well, that's why this package is so important. Because at least if there's 60, you know, at least that would give Ukraine a year, right? I don't think the war is going to be over in a year, but do you happen to have any water?
What, 1 minute?
Oh, thank you.
And what about her kind of opponent, Amos Harvey?
Oh my God, crazy guy. Yeah. I think he has kind of burnt out. I think he's not very popular. He's a sort of a Trump, you know, he's Trump only worse. I mean, because he's sort of stupid. I mean, Trump's stupid too, but Trump's, you know, smart like a fox. I don't think he's going anywhere. I think she's the only one that has a real chance. So, you know, let's hope. Yes, and then you.
Okay, first of all, I want to thank you for this thoughtful and really insightful presentation. And now I have lots of thoughts about this, and it's difficult for me to form into, you know, one question. But have you seen the television series House of Cards? Does a real voter does represent the American government?
Yeah, I didn't watch a lot of House of Cards. I think I watched one episode and I said this is a little melodramatic. So I think my answer is no. I mean, it's a combination of, so there's 435 members of Congress and 100 senators, and they're very varied. And some of them are, you know, Trump, only worse. I mean, the guy who the Matt Gaetz, I mean, he's just a thug, right? He was the guy who ousted McCarthy, who sort of caused all the trouble of the last, sorry, desperate. Some of them are literally, I mean, this isn't, you know, people have many, thank you. People have many, I'm not being a snob, but I mean, some of them are literally like car salesmen and gym teachers, right? Like they're not intellectuals at all. And sometimes a car salesman or a gym teacher can be a good member, but sometimes they're very ideological. Others are very thoughtful and very educated and very subtle. And so it's a wide range. And many of them, I was sort of worked in Washington for more than 20 years. It got harder and harder to compromise. You know, when I first got there, I worked with Senator McCain and Senator Kennedy, you know, strong conservative, strong liberal, to try to make immigration reform happen. And I was like the person that was sort of went back and forth between them. And that was, you know, they were two sides and they were trying to make that deal. And they were very thoughtful and they were very aware of their voters. They weren't saying, oh, screw my voters, but they were trying to bring their voters along for a good deal. I think it's gotten, the people like that, there are fewer and fewer of them. There are more and more of these people who just think the other side is evil. And anything that the other side says, they're going to bring up in some stupid soundbite thing. And that they're much less interested in compromising than in grandstanding, right? Even LBJ used to say, do you want, what did he call it? Do you want an issue or do you want a deal? A deal means compromise. An issue means something you can go to voters and say, the other guy's bad, vote for me. And so it's always been a problem, right? That comes with politics, right? There's always, you know, in a democracy. But there's still some very good ones. I did an event, I think 2 weeks ago, with two congressmen. I was like the moderator of a Democrat and a Republican, and they were not even people I'd known before, but they were incredibly thoughtful. So they weren't big shot congressmen; they're just ordinary congressmen, but they were really thoughtful, and they were both in favor of Ukrainian aid, and they both had really good arguments for their side, and they were both willing to say that their side was maybe wrong, and they were both willing to say maybe the other side has some good things going for it. And so they're still, even in the backbenches, even in the ones you don't know, some very impressive ones. And the question is, we just don't know, like, what's the mix? And again, Johnson, you know, I would have said before, John, if I looked at, on the first day, I looked at Johnson's record and I said, oh, Johnson is one of those bad guys. But I'm coming to think Johnson is kind of serious. I don't share a lot of his values. He's a very strong social conservative, but I think he's a subtle thinker and potentially going to be a decent player. Hi, thank you. I think you had a question. Yes, you still have a question. Your hand's been up the whole time.
I just wanted to follow up the question about the presidential candidate from the Republicans, Vivek Ramaswamy.
Yeah.
I just heard, I would rather say, an interesting opinion of his when during a Republican debate, he said some conspiracy theories about deep state and a lot of misinformation. And a few days ago, I saw a reaction video of a Republican voter of his words. And I'm interested not in Vivek as a person, but in what he's saying. And why do Republican voters and some Americans in general want to believe the worst, want to believe conspiracy theories, and want to find simple answers for difficult questions?
Yeah, I don't think, well, again, as I said before, I don't think he's important. I also don't think, I actually think conspiracy theories are not that common in America. When we make a mistake, we go the other way. We think the world is so simple. If he looks like a nice guy, he probably is a nice guy. We're not, you know, we sort of live in this kind of false innocence is the American problem, really. You know, false friendly, false too much trust, false innocence. Conspiracy theory is part of part of the sort of that European mindset that I think we want to get away from. So I think it's present. I mean, of course, human beings have conspiracy theory, but I don't think it's as common in America as, you know, some other places, but, you know, Russia.
Yeah, and
I mean, these are gross generalizations, right? You know, so forgive me, but we're playing. So yeah, go ahead.
and follow up about simplicity. I'm just curious. I saw that there's some people advocating for peace, meaning that Ukraine should sign a one-sided treaty to stop the war.
Yeah.
And so about the simplicity, do they think that Russia should also do something, at least stop shooting and start the dialogue, or they think that it's that
Yeah.
simple as
Well,
that?
again, this is where the naivete comes in, right? They think, oh, Russia can't be that bad. I mean, it's you know, it's really stupid, but they think like, oh, you know, we'll stop, we'll sit down, we'll make a deal, everybody will stick to that deal. I mean, they haven't read any history, right? They don't know anything about Russia, they don't know anything about Putin, but they kind of have this naive view, you know, let's stop the bloodshed. I mean, yeah. I mean, the ones I don't understand, to be honest. So somebody like J.D. Vance is a smart guy, powerful senator, in some ways the most, after Trump, the most powerful of these people who are wrong about Ukraine. I don't really understand which of my psychoanalyses motivate him. Because he's one of those who says, you know, sit down now, make a deal, let's stop the killing, let's have peace. I mean, what does he think? I really don't know. I mean, I think they expect Russia to make some concessions, at least stop, you know, the missiles would stop. And I think they must believe that the missiles would stop over, you know, over time. They don't, you know, they don't know, they don't understand, as we all know, that the missiles would stop for 5 minutes and then the missiles would start again. But they don't understand that. They don't have enough context.
But why do they believe that way? Is it ineffectiveness of Ukrainian public diplomacy, or is it they just?
It's very hard to persuade people of things. You know, when people have something deep in their heart, like you can always negotiate, then it's very hard to persuade them that's not true. You know, if you believe you can always sit down at the table and shake hands and negotiate, hard to persuade people that's not true. You know, you say, and I think it's partly because some of these other motives kick in, right? Like that's why the psychoanalysis is sort of interesting. They say, let's make a deal, but which of my motives are they really driven by, right? And you don't know. And that's where it's sort of important to I think it's important to try to figure out what's really, how does he tick? You know, what's going on there? But I think your average American thinks a lot of bloodshed, a lot of people dying. Wouldn't it be better if they stopped shooting each other? And that's as far as it goes. Someone else? Let's see if there's anybody who hasn't asked. I'll come back to you, but just give others a chance. Yes, please.
Thank you for your presentation. I have a question concerning the isolation in the United States. This week I've read the news that some European chairpersons are concerned that if Trump wins the elections, then United States may exit the NATO. And I have a question. Do you think that such harsh actions are possible if Trump wins the elections or not?
Well, he said for all his first term that he was going to exit NATO, and in the end he didn't. So it's hard to know. And he said in the first term he was going to build a wall along the Mexican border, and he didn't. So he does say a lot of things that he hasn't so far gotten around to doing. On the other hand, I don't put it past him to do it. So I don't, you know, I wouldn't say I'm 100% sure he will. I hope he'll be surrounded by people who will persuade him otherwise, but I wouldn't rule it out. I mean, it's very frightening, right? It's very frightening, but I think it's, yeah. You know, again, let's hope yeah. I mean, I can't say more than that, really. It's terrifying, you know, like, it's terrifying.
Thank
I
I have one question.
Okay.
I'm working for political analytics, so I have some professional questions. What do you recommend to read to me and students for about American politics? Maybe books, journals, magazines?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not immediately coming up with some good answers. So I read, well, I mean, yeah, that's a really good question. Let me think about it and see if I can make a list, a few things. I mean, I read the news I read a combination of like the US press and the European press. So I read like I read the first thing I read is the Wall Street Journal, and then I read actually the Financial Times and the Economist. And so it's just sometimes like the Brits have a perspective on American politics that you don't get from the American politics. Foreign affairs is like an important sort of organ of where the elites argue about foreign policy, but it's kind of dense. I mean, it's important, but it's not like I don't go there to learn something. I go there to see the arguments. It's like going down to the debating club and seeing them debating. To really understand American politics in a deeper way, that's a really good question, and that's what I have to think is like, what are a couple of good books that give you some perspective? Because there's a million books that are like, here's my campaign, or here's what I did yesterday, or here's whatever. So let me give it some thought.
I always think need to read an autobiography about American presidents like Obama, like Bush, like. All American presidents have an autobiography, and
yeah, well, again, I mean, it's I think history. I'm a believer that history you can learn from history. It might not be that you need all the detail of like of a 500-page biography, right? Like you probably don't need to know what Bush ate for breakfast when he was 22, right? I mean, Kissinger again, but like Kissinger is really smart. But Kissinger is one view. Kissinger is that realpolitik view. So I think it's hard to get a big, like, what I'm struggling to think of is something that would give you a big picture view without biases. That sort of a sweep of time that would give you kind of the big, because what you need is the big picture. You don't need all the little details. But let me give it some thought. Good questions. It's good to be stumped by a question. That's always good. Then you realize you thought something through enough. I think you had another question.
Yeah. I also have probably just one question about the Democrats. So we see that the main candidate from the Democratic Party is Joe Biden. So, and he's the most popular, but are there any chances for anybody else to be there? Because we've already seen the Kennedy Young Jr. and he's like something like the Ramos family, but Democratic edition.
Yeah, that's right. That's true.
But we, on the other hand, have Kamala Harris, for example.
Yeah, so there won't be another Democratic candidate. I mean, I fault Biden in many ways. I think Biden should have seen 9 months ago that he wasn't going to win and that he wasn't strong enough to beat Trump. And I think, he should have gotten out of the way and let somebody younger, more popular come along. He didn't do it, so he, whatever. So it's too late. There will be, and this is important, there will be these other candidates from third parties, and many of them are a little bit to the left, more to the left than to the right. They will take votes away from Biden. If it was just Biden-Trump, I think Biden would have more of a fighting chance. If these third parties really run, and if they get any traction, they're going to hurt Biden, help Trump. So it's like the wish for, the desire to see somebody better is actually going to do exactly what we don't want. It's likely get somebody worse. So I'm worried about those. I mean, I understand the impulse, I'm certainly with you, but I think the best hope for somebody, and again, if you're a diehard Democrat, this is probably not a good option, but I think the best hope for somebody who's not Trump is probably Nikki Haley.
Right.
I wish I could tell you a better story. It's not happy news, and Trump is the unhappiest of it. But I think, let's take it a step, what I've learned in Ukraine in many ways is take it a step at a time and do what you can, right? So let's hope we get the supplemental. Let's hope that it makes a difference and they start sending not just money, but the right weapons. Let's hope that the next year is productive and let's see where we are. The situation could be different. I mean, I wish I could say something more encouraging.
Okay, maybe the last questions and go to make a photo.
Oh, okay. Last questions? Yes, please.
About Trump's re-election politics and his posts, because it was really shocking for me that he and his supporters was touching some private parts of women's bodies. What do you think about that? For me, it is like a reason to exclude a candidate from the election because it is just a shock.
Well, no, of course. And I mean, even many of his voters, even more than Democrats, find that odious. But again, they say it comes down to choice between two people and two parties. And they say, well, the good, they said to themselves at the time, the good outweighed the bad. And I mean, it's hard to believe, right? All the things, that comment, November 6th, all of the things. But I mean, one thing I think is important here, like, don't just think like Trump bad, like Biden good, right? Like, I should have said this in the beginning, but Biden, has given I mean, I'm sure you all know this, but it bears repeating, Biden has given Ukraine enough aid so that the Russians don't win, but he hasn't given you enough aid so that you win. Right. So there's a problem on the Democratic side too, right? I mean, Biden and Trump it's complicated because you look at it and you say, well, it's a seesaw and Trump is really bad. And I'm not saying Trump would be in any way better, but Biden, we need to do some work on Biden too. If Biden stays, if we're lucky enough that Biden gets reelected, he has to up the game, right? Like this giving like half, let Ukraine fight with the one hand behind its back. Like that's not good enough, right? So that's why it's important to think about the pressure points on both sides, right? Like both sides need pushing. So, I understand you're very focused on Trump and you're right to be very focused on Trump, but we have another year and we have a lot of people in Congress and think about both sides. And that argument about, not enough aid is really important too.
Maybe last question. I have a question concerning foreign policy of the United States. First of all, I would like to know how can you describe it, and secondly, is it still, this realism where we have sphere of influence, or is it something of the past? Like words of Kissinger.
Well, they're definitely, it's always a mix, right? So that's the point. It's always like, think of a braid, it's always, there's different views. So I think, if you imagine like the meetings in the Biden White House for the last 2 years, there was always somebody in that room saying realpolitik. There was always someone saying you can't destroy Russia because you'd leave a vacuum, and then the Chinese would fill the vacuum, and then something else bad would happen. And think about the balance of power. There was always somebody arguing that. Now, who exactly? I'm not sure, but there was always somebody arguing that. And then there was somebody else who was saying, come on, you got to do this. You got to get this done. You can't let Ukraine lose. So it was always kind of a mix. And I would say that Biden's policy on Ukraine was a little bit of a mix. It had enough realpolitik in it that he didn't say, let's totally undermine Russia, right? He could have said that. He could have said, give Ukraine enough to bomb Moscow. He didn't because he felt that you needed some balance of power considerations. It wasn't all balance of power because he did as much as he did, but it was a mix. So it's a little bit, again, that's why I tried to show all these different sides with all these different reasons. There are many things that go into it. It's like when someone does an act, like you go down the street and someone is kind to you. Partly they're being kind because they're really kind. Partly they're being kind because they have something to gain. Partly they're being kind because they calculate what will happen later if they're kind now. People have very mixed motives, and a country as big as America, very mixed motives. So it's sort of important to understand that it's a mix and then think about how to make the best argument to bring out what you want.
Let's say thank you so much.
Yeah,
Do you have a short question?
Well, yes, but maybe, like, How do you envision the political landscape in the USA in the future? Like maybe some thoughts about the technology advancements.
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's a really, really good question because again,
Sorry, I jumped this morning because I saw you using ChatGPT like right before this question. So exactly how technologies directly affect the politics. I hope this question is not related by ChatGPT. Sorry.
So, again, for years, I went to Washington first in 2004 and started to work on immigration issues. And in 2004, we were already saying, it's so polarized now. We want to go back to the day like 20 years before when the Democrats and the Republicans worked together. And we said, it's impossibly polarized now, we said in 2004. And now 2004 looks like, heaven. Like McCain and Kennedy could sit in a room and make a deal like that. That's so hard to imagine now. And it still happens in pockets, but much, much less. And so, what I see is a pretty steady slide toward what I would call this polarization, where they really don't just think the other side is wrong. They think the other side is evil. You can't make a deal with someone you think is evil. You can't really talk to someone you think is evil. You can't really hear them, right? And there are exceptions. I mean, I used to work on an issue that had to do with like funding for education for like skills training, like not university, but skills training technical workers. And the two sides that disagree on that, yesterday they made a deal. And they're going to pass a bill and spend a lot of money. And these people who I've watched for a decade, like spitting at each other across the table, were sitting there saying, well, we're making a deal now. I don't like everything in this deal, but I'm going to make this deal because I'm going to get what I need. So there is still, when they need to, when they can, they come together around bipartisanship. And if Schumer and McConnell can come together around Ukraine, that's again another kind of the exception that proves the rule. It's still possible. But I am worried that over the long haul, what we're seeing is more and more of this partisanship. And I don't see what is going to reverse that. Like 9/11 reversed it for like 5 minutes. For 5 minutes, they all hugged each other and they said, we're in this together. And then after 5 minutes, they were back to he's evil, she's evil, right? So I don't see what's going to reverse this trend toward polarization. Now, maybe technology will help. Maybe generational change will help. Maybe making some big bad mistake somewhere, Trump comes and it's just a disaster, that will help. It's hard to know what reverses course. But again, I wouldn't give you a rose. I'm sure it's going to be rose